Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. The business in the Chamber's finished, so we have permission to get started. Thank you all very much for coming. For anyone I don't know that I've not met yet, my name's Ross Greer. I'm a Green MSP for the West of Scotland, and I'm also, as I'm constantly reminded, the youngest ever elected member of the Scottish Parliament. So I've been led to believe that I will grow older in the future and that I might be an appropriate host for today's discussion. Thank you all for coming. This is an event for our Future Forum, which does what it says in the tin. The Scotland's Future Forum is a think tank in the Parliament that gives us an opportunity, not just for MSPs, but for others within Scotland's public sphere and for anyone who wants to get engaged, to have discussions about our long-term aspirations for this country, what we think our current trajectory is, what we want that trajectory to be. And the discussion that we're having tonight is part of our Scotland 2030 programme, which again does what it says on the tin. It's about where we think Scotland will be in 2030, where we want Scotland to be in 2030. And through these themed discussions like the ones we're having tonight, it's about challenging those who are participating, not just up here on the panel, but everyone in the room, to have a think about the long-term opportunities that exist and to really develop some visions for our future. This is a discussion event. It's not simply a presentation from those on the panel. Tonight's focus, we're looking at growing older. So as part of our preparation for this, we're talking about the fact that we're all very well aware more people are living longer now. That was a more accurate statement up until the life expectancy stats came out a couple of days ago. It's a slightly less accurate stat now, but still essentially the case. But we want to consider the public policy implications of this, but also the societal and the cultural implications. What will it mean to grow older in the future? What will it mean to be older in 2030 and 2040, 2050? And what are the considerations that we should have now about that, what that means for us over the next couple of decades? Long-term discussions, long-term visions are something that we often struggle to have and struggle to articulate well in politics. For those of us here in the Parliament, it can be a challenge to think beyond the next election, such as the way electoral politics works. But that's what's so important about nights like this. So I'll briefly introduce the panel and give you a description of how the format of the evening is going to go. So I'm delighted that we're joined by Robin Lloyd-Jones. Robin is an award-winning writer of novels, short stories, non-fiction and radio drama. Most recently, as I'm sure folk in here will be aware of, Robin published Autumn Voices. It's a book that examines creativity in later years. Based on interviews with 19 Scottish writers over the age of 70, including Sheena Blackhall, Alistair Gray and James Kelwin, Autumn Voices explores how productivity and creativity can be extended well into later life, with the writers providing role models for future generations, a perfect perspective to bring to this evening's discussion. We also have, and I'm really delighted about this, we've got Robert McCall, MSYP, who is a member of Communicating, which I think I pronounced right. He's working as a co-design champion for the Year of Young People, and as I mentioned, Robert's a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, which I'm a former member of, which is why I'm so pleased to have him here. He's an MSYP representing young people in Perthshire North constituency. I'd really like to thank Robert because he stepped in at the last minute to replace Rachel Tidmore, who was really enthusiastic about coming tonight, but unfortunately fell ill and isn't able to. But before we get to the panel discussion, we've got a presentation from Dr. Elaine Douglas and Professor Bell. So briefly introduce the two of them. Elaine is a research fellow at the University of Stirling. She has a PhD in public health, and she's interested in all aspects of health across the life course, especially older ages. Elaine and David work together on the Health Ageing in Scotland project at the University of Stirling. So, as we mentioned, David is a professor of economics at the University of Stirling. He's been there since 1990. He's held numerous other roles, including as a budget advisor to the Finance Committee here at this Parliament, special advisor to the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and he's an honorary fellow of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. So we're delighted to have David and Elaine to give the opening presentation. I'd like to welcome them both up to begin now.
Thanks very much, Ross. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm a person who's very interested in data. I just have always loved numbers. I apologise. I'm not one of the creative novel writing types. But what I want to do or rather what we want to do in terms of this evening's presentation. I'm going to lead off talking about some of the issues that relate very much to Scotland's ageing society. And then Elaine is going to follow up with a discussion around some of the research that we've been doing, and specifically the data on older people that we've been collecting and where we plan to take that further. Because, as Ross says, we're looking to 2030 if we are going to develop good policies through the Scottish Parliament. For then, it has to be based on good evidence. I mean, I know some politicians south of the border don't think much of evidence, but I'm afraid in the land of David Hume, we think in the opposite way. So let me start. So this is Growing Older and Future Scotland Insights from Healthy Ageing in Scotland. We struggled with the Americans who funded this study because haggis is still a banned foodstuff in the States, but eventually we brought them round to it. So just some general points to start off with. Older people in Scotland hold most of the wealth of the country in the form of housing and often forgotten pensions. Pensions and housing together are the major forms of wealth holding in the UK as a whole. Savings other than pensions are much, much smaller. Typically, older people have higher incomes than the young, largely because they have more experience, more human capital, as we would term it in economics, and they also joined the labour market when it was more buoyant. Back in the 70s or the 80s. Well, it may not have seemed all that buoyant then, but relative to now, it's some of the factors that certainly led them to a better labour market trajectory. They also pay more tax, which is very important for the Scottish Parliament now that it's getting more powers over tax. Income tax, value-added tax are two key taxes that are new to Scotland that actually older people contribute, and I'm here talking about the over 50s, contribute to more than to those in the labour market aged less than 50. Older people also make use of more public services too, particularly in health and social care, but also in the form of social security benefits. So the Scottish Parliament is getting powers over a number of welfare benefits. Social Security Scotland is being set up. Most of these benefits relate to disability, and it's older people that are typically more disabled. So that's one major new spending responsibility that the Scottish Parliament will have, that again is going to affect more older people more than it will affect younger people. Obviously, state pensions are another they're of substantial importance to the income of older pensions. They remain a UK Westminster a responsibility, but nevertheless they're very important. So in a sense, older people interact more with the state than do the young. Maybe that's why they're more likely to vote. Maybe it's something about past generations and responsibility, but they certainly interact more with the state. And actually a lot of the schisms in British politics are now not left-right, but a bit more old-young. I don't want to go there at this minute. Maybe you would want to take that up in the discussion. So some of this may be quite familiar, but if you look at different age groups and the expected growth between 2016 and 2041, and you look at those aged 0 to 64, if you say at 2016 we were at 100, there's actually no growth. It's absolutely flat. And that assumes a certain amount of in-migration from the European Union, which may not now be happening. If you take those aged 65 to 70, they will grow and then actually tail off towards the end of the period, because that will be the end of the baby boomers. The ones that are going to grow most rapidly are those aged 80 plus. So if they were 100 in 2016, they're over 180. They've grown by 80%, those aged 80 plus over that time period. So that's a small flavour of how Scotland's demography is changing. And this is typically, this looks quite complicated, but it's typically how people have money spent on them by the state during their lifetimes, and how they pay taxes during their lifetimes. So if you start at age 1, the state doesn't spend all that much on you. Your education causes a blip when you're relatively young. Once you get into the labour market, you start paying a lot of tax. But then come age 60 or so, a number of factors kick in. One is health spending. Another is long-term care, which kicks in mainly among the oldest but also welfare spending, which is mainly the state pensions. So at older age groups, there's a variety of public services that people are making use of. They mainly are contributing towards those services when they're of working age. Now, that kind of brings up the issue of generational equality. The idea that if you're going to maintain the structure that we saw in the last slide, there has to be a kind of contract between the generations, that those who are paying the tax are willing to pay for the set of services that the old need, and then the same thing will happen next time round. Now, one thing that kind of cemented that was that successive generations earn more than their predecessors did. And we can see this. This is, again, it's slightly complicated. It's years of age along the bottom, again, but it's different age groups. So it's the greatest generation, the silent generation, the baby boomers, I'm afraid that's me, Generation X and the millennials. So what these profiles show is that as the economy was growing, then the silent generation earn more than the greatest generation. The baby boomers earn more than the silent generation. Generation X may earn more than the baby boomers, but we're actually starting to see the millennials earning slightly less than the previous generation. So this is an issue that we haven't confronted for a very long time, the possibility that children may earn less over their lifetimes than their parents. So equity has a number of dimensions. You can think of equity across all of the people of the same age living in Scotland now, but you also have to think of equity as equity between different age groups of people. Okay, so one of the things that has happened since the recession, again looking at the different age groups and calling them 100, is that we've seen different rates of growth in the employment of different age groups. So those aged 35 to 49, there's been virtually no change in employment. Those aged 25 to 34, a slight growth. Some of that may be driven by immigration. Slight growth in the 50 to 64-year-olds. Very substantial growth in those aged 65 plus working in the labour market since the Great Recession. They are not, in terms of size, they're not that big. I just all started them all at 100. The actual number is much smaller, but they're the group that's growing fastest. So you end up actually with possibly more inequity among the that age group because some are healthy enough to continue to work, whereas others have, for whatever reason, got health problems and are not able to work beyond what is now the state retirement age. Of course, there's the issue of pensions and when state pensions kick in and when people know about when their pension age is changing, which is a whole other ballgame which maybe you want to take up in discussion. One thing we do know is that older workers work fewer hours per week, although they contribute to the labour market typically by age. The number of hours per week drops off quite sharply. So after about age 60, they're working about 30 hours a week or thereabouts. So now here is a slide that will shock you. It shocked me when I saw it first, and it's a guy, Jose Luis Fernandez from LSE, who's kindly let me use it, although I've added the Scottish figures. So this is the number of people being supported in terms of long-term care, 2005 to 2016 in different countries, and that's Germany. And that's what you would expect. With an ageing population, more people are getting long-term care. That's France. Again, the same pattern. That's Scotland. And that's England. That's really what happens when you squeeze local authority funding till the pips squeak. And we now have a situation of real crisis down south in terms of long-term care funding. One of the key issues, obviously, for older people. I'm nearly at the end. I'm just pick another issue that's quite important. Alzheimer's UK did a piece of work recently on the costs of dementia. And these costs are very substantial, 26 billion a year for the UK as a whole. This map actually shows the prevalence of dementia in different parts of Scotland. The map continues for the whole of the UK, so darker colours means higher prevalence. The estimate by Alzheimer's UK was that 67,000 people in Scotland have dementia. We are doing some analysis of the prevalence and the costs at the University of Stirling, but the estimated cost roughly is 2 billion a year. And health service budget in Scotland is about 13 billion a year. However, because of the ageing population, particularly the oldest since dementia its prevalence is very sensitive to age. We expect the cost to increase by a further 400 million by 2025. So what I've tried to do is to give you some bits of evidence around the ageing population. It's been very selective. There are lots of other things that I could have talked about. But what I'll do now is hand over to Elaine, who'll talk you through where we've started in terms of trying to get a comprehensive picture of older people in Scotland.
Thank you, David. Okay, so as David says, I'm going to pick up and talk to you just now about a study that we have started at University of Stirling called Healthy Ageing in Scotland, or otherwise known as Haggis. Now, we are a new study, but we are not completely new in the sense that what we do is similar to studies that are carried out all across the world. So all these logos that are on here are from other studies that we would term our sister studies. We ask the same type of questions, which enables us to do comparisons across the world. So they started out in places like, the States originally started it. They're in Mexico, they're in India, they're in China, they're in Japan. Ireland, Northern Ireland, England, the English longitudinal study of ageing, ELSA, it's now starting on its 9th wave, which means it's been following people every 2 years since 2002. So what you're able to do is get a really comprehensive picture of what happens to people over periods of time. And what's really important about that and about the study that we're setting out to do in Haggis is that means that you can actually start to understand the pathways and the journeys that people take as they live their lives. We can start to understand what causes what, what came first. The kind of cause and effect, those kinds of things, rather than just working out what sort of things similarly go together. So here are some of the issues that we cover. So to explain we primarily run a large survey. So you may be familiar with other surveys like the Scottish Health Survey, etc. Well, we focus particularly on older people, and we cover a broad range of topics across social and economic and health topics. And this means that we can build up a full picture of the key issues that are around for people. So we can see and here we cover things like people's own health and social care, what helpers they might get if they have them at all. We ask them about their retirement plans if they're not yet retired. If they are retired, we ask them about how life is going for them then. We look at all sorts of different issues, including loneliness and social isolation, well-being, standard of living, and other topics like financial literacy that's very important for people in order to plan their, for example, their retirement planning, etc. This is a poster we have. I'm going to zoom in on some of these because I don't think it's coming across too well, but this is some information that we have. So to focus in, as I say, what is Haggis? Well, we are this large study where we're focused on people aged 50 and above. In our what we termed our pilot study, we recruited 1,000 people, which would give us a kind of fair representation of what's going on for older people within Scotland. But as we move into what we call our first full wave, then we'll be increasing that to 6,000 people, which will mean that we'll be much more representative. Certainly we can pick up things at health board level, etc. So our initial funding was from the National Institute of Ageing, who also funded the American study and support many other studies. The funding landscape is ever-changing, but certainly that's been our background, and we're looking for funding for the future. So our motivations, why Scotland when there's so many other studies around? And as I've mentioned, there's the English longitudinal study of ageing. Certainly England has, in terms of the UK, is a greater sort of proportion of the overall population. Why can't that speak for the UK? Well, they can in many ways because we have quite distinct and unique profiles within Scotland that include that, unfortunately, we have a poorer health and life expectancy. We have massive health inequalities. So the gap between healthy outcomes in those who are wealthier in our country and those who are poorer are much broader than you would find in other parts of the UK, and actually they're more common with the likes of health inequalities that you would find in the States. So one of the advantages of having these cross-country comparison studies is that actually we might be able to learn from the different sort of otherwise political landscape that you might have between Scotland and the US, but we might be able to compare different policies. And certainly in terms of within the UK, the fact that we would have an English longitudinal study of ageing and a Scottish study of ageing, as in Haggis, would mean that although there are many other similarities in our populations, looking at where policies diverge will mean that we can learn from each other about where some things work out quite well and maybe where we might want to make some changes. So how can we be world leaders? Well, I hope I've covered some of the areas why we might be that, but I'm going to very quickly, I'm conscious of time, but I'm going to very quickly pick up on some key issues. One of the things that we have in Scotland that we should be justly proud of is our administrative data systems. And what I mean by that, I mean the kind of data that our government gather from us on a day-to-day basis. So it can be about our health, it can be about our social care, our education, our tax. But what we have done in Scotland is we have a unique identifier for everyone through Scotland who's registered here and living. So what we can do, with permission of course, is we can ask to link the surveys, the very detailed survey responses that people give to their, for example, their NHS health data. So where that is enabled, then it means that actually we can follow people's individual characteristics along with their health service use. This is not something that can be done easily elsewhere. In England and other parts of the UK, they don't have that unique identifier, and it limits the research that they are able to do. So we're very fortunate to be in that particular situation. What we were able to do in the pilot was ask people, as I say, for their permission, of course, to link to those data. We also have to ask the data controllers, as in the Scottish NHS guardians, for their permission. But what we got from our study was actually a kind of 85% of our study agreeing to link to those health. Now, what that means we can do later on, we can go on to look not just at health service usage in different types of the population. So one example might be we might want to look at smokers versus non-smokers and look at the kind of health service usage that they have. We might want to look at different age groups, etc. One of the other things, because of this linkage, that we're able to do, and we believe it's fairly unique across the entire world, is about being able to cost a health service. And that is one of the things that we are looking to do in our next stage of our study. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is really to explain more about how we are able to use the administrative data in a way that gives us what is sometimes termed by people a population spine. So it means that we can have a full sort of unique list of individuals, and we can start to understand the people who would take part in our survey, which is great. We have lots of information from them, but we know also that some people don't take part, and sometimes that can be the people who are more sick and therefore unable to take part, or perhaps people from more deprived areas. So in order to make sure that we know how representative we are of the overall population, then we have ways that we can work that out using our data linkage. So where does haggis fit in? I'm just going to use one example that seems to be hitting the headlines very much just now, which is really about social isolation and loneliness. I have to say this is not an issue that is only for older people. We know that it affects younger people too, but we also do know that in older people, there are many groups of older people who are particularly susceptible to loneliness or social isolation. However, we need to be clear that social isolation and loneliness are not the same thing. So some people can be quite socially isolated and actually quite happy being on their own. Other people can be lonely in a crowd, and understanding how the interrelationship between those two important concepts fit in and manifest themselves in people is one of the things that we've been looking at Haggis. So in this particular study, what we did was we looked at profiles of different people who presented as socially isolated or social connectedness, whatever way you want to look at it. And on the left-hand side, we've got people who were really highly connected with all. They'd seen their friends a lot, they saw their close family, and there was lots of contact, both face-to-face, by telephone, etc., etc. Now, I'm not sure how clearly that's coming out, but even some of them, very few of them, but some of them would report being lonely at certain times. I think most of us probably in this room have felt lonely at certain points in our life, regardless of how connected we otherwise feel. But likewise, we can go in and we can look at other groups to see, right, out of the people who are often lonely, how do they fit within the other broad profiles. Now, what's important about this, apart from pulling apart a kind of distinction between these two sort of states of being, if you like, is that perhaps in terms of public health research we can start to maybe focus some of the support that we want upon particular groups, because solutions to loneliness in one group might not be solutions for another, and understanding those kind of groups. So this is an example of some of the things that we might be able to sort of take forward. So just to sort of finish up, where are we now? Well, we've finished our initial pilot. We are looking for funding so that we can run our first full wave. And as part of that, as I've said, we're going to increase our sample size, and we look forward to being able to be on the global map alongside a lot of these very important other ageing studies. Thank you.